Droughts affecting a lot of areas, flooding because of high precipitation, hurricanes. This is a picture from Puerto Rico, industrial banana production. So there's no doubt that climate change is affecting agroecosystems, but whether all agroecosystems are vulnerable at the same level, that's the question. And our studies have shown that they have strategies that have used over centuries that have overcome climatic variability. So there's a lot to learn from small farmers. And they offer a range of management options and designs that increase functional biodiversity in croplands, but at the same time that reinforces the resiliency of agroecosystems. So for example, let me go through some examples of these traditional systems. This is in Mexico. The Aztecs actually developed in the Valley of the Moon, where Mexico City is now, these systems called chinampas, which are systems that are raised beds surrounded by water canals. They used to feed more than 2 million people in the times of the empire, the Aztec Empire. Now there's about 40 hectares left in the Mixquic region, and this is a system in which they were able to have agriculture in the midst of in the midst of flooding periods. Next one. Also happens in other parts of the world. For example, in Bangladesh, you will find the same strategy. Raised beds is a very common way of integrating agriculture and aquaculture in different parts of the world. Next is the ocean gardens in China, same thing. So this is a common strategy in areas that are subject to flooding. Agricultural systems have emerged with this technique of raised fields, they call it. Next. This is the same system, but this is happening at 3,500 meters above sea level, the famous waru-warus, which are traditional systems of raised fields surrounded by water from the Titicaca Valley, Titicaca Lake. And you can grow crops in the midst of frost here because the water absorbs the heat during the day, releases it at night, and changes the microclimate in 1 to 2 degrees, and that's enough to offset the drought. I'm sorry, the frost. Next. This is in Colombia, in the Chocó, which is the Pacific region. This area receives 6,000 millimeters or 8,000 millimeters of rain per year. That's a lot. 6 meters, 8 meters. So what they do is they have this elevated raised beds. They're like tables in which they grow their crops. Or they would grow them in the trees on big bamboo area, like a canoe cut in half and filled with soil, and there they grow the plants. Because these areas are flooded during 3-4 months in a year.
Sorry, I am very sorry for being so annoying here.
Okay.
Just trying to help you out.
No, that's fine. Okay. The next one is there's a lot of agroforestry systems. Most of the cocoa and chocolate and coffee is grown in agroforestry systems, but there's a tendency towards basically simplifying the systems for coffee production, high yielding varieties, and so on. So you can see here the change, for example, next from an agroforestry system to unshaded coffee. Here you have a higher productivity of coffee. Sometimes you can have the varieties that have better quality and so on. But when that happens, you subject the system to higher evapotranspiration. So you can see here the evapotranspiration in a system without shade compared to an agroforestry system. So when the drought comes, those systems are very vulnerable when you have the monoculture. So basically we call them business systems that are systems that fail with grace and systems that fail without grace. Okay? The other thing is that there are a lot of farmers in many parts of the world, they grow their crops in rain-fed areas, seasonal planting. So for example, this system in Ecuador, in the south of Ecuador, is called the orillado. When the farmers grow their crops up in the hills, then they come down to the river that is going to dry. So at the beginning, they grow their crops when there's water on these mounds, but as you get away from the water, then they grow them in these holes where they find the moisture. A lot of farmers use a lot of organic matter from compost, they harvest the litter from forest, all kinds of sources of organic matter is fundamental, because as you know, it creates, enhances organic matter in the soil, and then that increases the water holding capacity. So every time you increase your organic matter content 1%, you can actually store about 1.5 liters of water per square meter. So, next. So everybody's familiar with this study from Rodale, where actually in the long-term study that they did, the organic system always does better than the conventional when there's a drought. Because again, the effects of organic matter. These systems called the ZAI are very typical in Africa also, where farmers do this half moon. They fill it up with compost, and then they grow their corn there without actually water. It's expanding throughout many parts of the Sahel. These are systems in the Canary Islands where they create this kind of walls that are very important to stop the wind, which has a desiccating effect. They pile all the organic matter there, and that also keeps the moisture, the little moisture that there is. So this is a way of growing grapes in the Canary Islands. The other thing that organic matter does, obviously, is enhances our soil microbiology and microbiological activity. There's a lot of fungi and bacteria that are present. Some of them are beneficial, some of them are pathogenic, but usually you have antagonists that are controlling the pathogenic ones. And one of the things that happens is that one part of this microfauna and microflora are the mycorrhizae, these fungi that actually extend biologically the root system about 50 to 70%. So here's a tomato with mycorrhiza, without mycorrhiza, and a tomato with mycorrhiza. The same variety, the same planting date. The only difference that this one has mycorrhiza, this one doesn't. So as you can see that the volume of root system enhances the capacity of that plant to explore the soil profile for water. So there's a very simple technique actually that the Cubans use, where you go to a forest, so you harvest the litter from the forest, then you put it in a box mixed with soil, and you grow sorghum. And sorghum is a plant that gets a lot of mycorrhiza infection. It's one of the easiest ones to get infected with mycorrhiza from the litter. And then they cut that area part, and then the roots and the soil that is there, they put it on the ground for a while to dry, and then that's the source of mycorrhiza they can use to put in their pots or in the fields or in the compost pile and so on and so on. Obviously, another practice to deal with drought is mulching, because it reduces evaporation and also increases infiltration. As you can see, the thicker the mulch, the more infiltration you have in your soil. And infiltration is good actually, because it means you have a good soil structure. So you have a lot of macropores and micropores that store water. And this is another example from Cuba. The other thing is using the local varieties. I mean, small farmers have about 2 million varieties of crops in their hands. The Green Revolution only produced 7,000. That's the comparison. Okay. So all this material, we know about the potential of them, about 25% of them. And the land races, for example, in Mexico, you can see there are different land races, and they're adapted at different precipitation levels, at different altitudinal levels. So you can find varieties that can grow at 3,000 meters with zero precipitation. For example, one system is called the cajete, the maíz de cajete. This is a variety, it's a land race. We actually, it's called the cajete because they make a deep hole, about 10 centimeters, and they put 3 or 4 grains of seeds of corn in there, and then the corn germinates without water, without rain. So, but you have to learn how to read the moisture of the soil, how deep you have to plant. All that comes with the culture, with the knowledge that these peasants have. It's not just bring the seed and planting without knowing the soil conditions that are necessary. And there's a very interesting study between the wheat varieties of the Green Revolution and the native varieties. And you can see that, yes, when you have water and you have fertilizer, the burlap variety, the Green Revolution variety, has a higher yield. But what happens when you look at the yield in terms of not only tons per hectare per hectare, but tons per hectare or kilograms per hectare per centimeter of water? You can see that the traditional variety is much more efficient in the use of water. And the same thing with fertilizer. So basically what we're talking about is a higher use efficiency of water by the local varieties. Another strategy that farmers use is polycultures, which I talked about before. For example, if you don't put all your eggs in one basket, these farmers never listened to the Green Revolution guys that were right there in Mexico and CIMIT, which is one of the international centers. They adopted their varieties, but they kept their polyculture with fava beans. This is in Tlaxcala, in a high area. And why did they did not go into just monoculture? Because they knew when the frost came, look at who died. The Green Revolution variety, and the fava beans remained there. So a lot of research has been done on polyculture systems and compared to monoculture in terms of coefficient of variability of yield. This tells you, the resiliency. Look at, that means for every 33% of the cases there will be a failure as opposed to 28% cassava maize as opposed to 18% if you have a polyculture. So you reduce your risk, and that has been the main strategy why farmers use the system. They're reducing risk in many ways. There's a lot of techniques of water harvesting from the roofs and so on. There's also, this is very interesting in the semi-arid of Brazil. What they build are these cisterns that harvest water, and they have been able to now promote this. So basically what you have here, this is like imagine a basketball field that is a little bit inclined. So it's looking this way. So the water falls there and comes into here. And then the rest of the year they use this for playing football or drying their materials or whatever. It's like a terrace, but the main function is water harvesting. And it goes into this cistern. Next. Huh? Oh, the other technique they use is that they put the prickly pear leaves. I don't know here, but in California, when they reforest with pines, they put this plastic, what do they call them? The biocolloids or something that are very expensive in the hole, and then they put the tree. Well, you can do the same thing with prickly pear. That's a source of water of any crop that you're going to have there. So they put the prickly pear, then a layer of soil, then they plant the seeds, and that will be the water available for those plants to emerge. Other systems, the agroforestry system, for example, Ensete is this kind of looks like a banana, but it's not. It's a way of collecting water. They actually, because of the architecture, it's a source of water for the system. It's like a water harvester. It's a plant that plays that function. So they introduce them in a lot of agroforestry systems. So when we talk about resiliency, we're talking about the resistance to shock, but also about the capacity to recover from that shock. So many studies, I mentioned this morning, the study that was comparing the impact of Hurricane Mitch in Central America, where they found that the agroecological farms, especially in Honduras, where it hit the most, were less damaged from landslides mostly. The effect was there. And with Ike, I also mentioned this morning. This is a farm right after Ike. This is a farm that resisted. This is the recovery rate. You can see that the farms that were in monoculture took longer to recover than number 3, which are farms that are much more complex. They recover faster. And when I say recover, they say in Spanish, parar la finca. That means the bananas and all the trees fell down, but they were not disconnected from the soil. So all they do is just put them up again with a stick and put some rocks and compost, whereas the monoculture systems, the trees were flown away meters and meters away. Next. So having windbreaks is a very fundamental strategy in areas that are prone to hurricanes. And the other thing is to, as I was mentioning also this morning, is transforming this monoculture grasslands into the silvopastoral systems. And here, there are many, many examples from Colombia. There's a fantastic group called CIPAD that has been doing this work for 30 years, where they convert these deserts into basically these green islands. And here you can see that you can increase your carrying capacity from 1.2 animals to 5.1 per hectare. So you increase the carrying capacity because these are fodder shrubs and trees that the animals eat. Actually, cows browse naturally. It's just that with our pasture, we just force them to eat down. But if you give them shrubs, they will eat. They will browse. The animal body condition increases, and you can see the increase in milk production from 1.7 liters a day, which is very low, this is in the tropics, to 4.1 in those systems. 4 times more production of milk. So this is the way it looks like. It's like a story building. You have the grasses, the shrubs, which is lucina as a legume, and then you have other trees that are going to provide other services. So that creates a microclimate, which actually allows to improve the fodder and the water holding capacity of the system and the production of the milk, because the condition of the animals is much better. The other is that these farms many times are surrounded by landscapes that are denuded, so you can increase also the resiliency by enhancing the nature's matrix, the matrix that is surrounding, the landscape matrix that is surrounding the farm. So this is a farm in the Secano, which is the rain-fed areas of the coastal parts of Chile, which is very similar to California. And, well, you can see that's the farm. So the challenge here that we had was in the 1980s again. Can we recover that territory, that land, and can we create there an agroecological lighthouse? So the evolution of this was there, until 2007. So you can see that this farm now has recovered the landscape, and at the same time it's a very productive place. I gave you an example this morning also of these farmers in Colombia, where they were able to restore the landscape diversity, the watershed, reforested the watershed, and this allowed for now systems of production because there's water available for irrigation as well as for the family consumption. So one of the things that we're working with is indicators, thresholds, in which we can say, okay, the landscape matrix has been recovered to a point that allows now for agriculture to be resilient if it practiced within the landscape matrix. So, for example, more than 70% of the land has to be covered by vegetation surrounding the farm. No more than 25% of the land area showing signs of degradation. At least 50% of the land area using improved agroecological practices. Noticeable presence of hedgerows, corridors, riparian forests, no less than 50% of these features. At least 50% of the forest fragments protected, and no less than 50% of water courses protected from contamination. So these are kind of thresholds that we have found that are necessary to meet in order to have a viable agriculture within these landscapes. So one of the things that we are working on, and we're offered these courses in Latin America in different parts, called Ecological Restoration. Because agroecology usually works at the farm level, but then we have to work at the landscape level. That's where ecological restoration comes in. So we work with a team of people that are experts in ecological restoration of landscapes. And that provides this framework of recovering the landscape and at the same time making agriculture more viable. So Clara is going to go into the details of resiliency and the methodologies that we have developed that are farmer friendly. This is not for publications in journals or for people to become famous in academia. It's a tool that farmers can use to assess the resiliency, and we understand that resiliency, if the ecosystem is able to resist and recover, and we, from our sources, our research, we have found that diversified ecosystems are able to retain their structure in the presence of these shocks. And we talk about two types of diversity. There's a very strong relationship between diversity and resiliency. Compensation, that means when you have a complex system, if one component fails, the other replaces it. That's compensation. And the other one is redundancy. Sometimes you feel that you have many species there that cannot, you don't know what function they're playing. It could be too many legumes. But it turns out that when the shock comes, when the global change, the change happens, the environmental change, then those species that you thought were not important start playing an important role. So, to summarize, we can work at the field level with species, at the farming system level, and at the landscape level. We have to approach the three components, or the three scales. And then what we are finding is that the socio-ecological resiliency features of these systems, after you have been able to design these farms, there has to be several things that are important to consider. High levels of biodiversity and species redundancy. For example, many varieties of the same crop species. High connectivity and complementarity between farm components, so connectivity with the landscape, and complementarity between the components of the system. High spatial and temporal heterogeneity, both at the farm level and at the landscape level. High levels of autonomy and independence. That's very important because many of these farmers, for example, are functioning in areas that are totally remote, and sometimes, for example, when we went to Puerto Rico this summer, most of the farms that were isolated because of mudslides. And then, of course, the helicopters of the U.S. were throwing Kit Kat chocolates and paper towels. So if you could become totally isolated, these communities, when they have, for example, seed banks, food banks, community seed banks, community food banks, are much more resilient than farms that don't, obviously. So in Puerto Rico, many of them suffer because they didn't have seed banks, they didn't have food banks, local food banks. Socially self-organized communities, reflective people that anticipate change, high levels of cooperation, exchange, fundamental, as I was saying this morning, social organization. Community honors legacy. That's very important. Traditional knowledge. Many of these systems that I showed you before are the legacy that we need to incorporate into the strategy. It's not going to be solved by modern science coming from universities alone. And then, obviously, capital, human capital, in order to be able to mobilize the resources that are needed, especially self-help and so on, and through social networks. Because when in Cuba a hurricane comes, parar la finca, to stand up the farm, means lots of people come and help in that farm for a week. Then they go to the next farm, and they all work together to parar la finca, and let's go and parar that finca, and then it takes a long time, but everybody's working together. So that's very important. Well, with that, then I'm going to give it to Clara, because that's the most important part, I think, is the methodologies. How do we assess the resiliency of these farms with methodologies that are simple and that farmers can utilize?
Any questions real quick?
Yeah, hello everybody. We work together, so we also are, he's my husband, and we have been together 24 years. So I think I can say that I'm the resilient of the merge. A good example of resilience. Anyway, so I wanted to talk about methodologies. As Miguel mentioned, we have a network of scientists in Latin America called Red Agres. We are 20 scientists working in 8 countries. So Miguel this morning talked about one of the challenges is to move conventional agriculture to more diversified farming system using agroecological principles. And so for that, it's very important, at least for farmers, to know how to assess the health of the ecosystem. And also, it could be during the process of conversion or especially for NGOs that work in a territory to see, and they are working with different farmers to see what farmers are doing better. And the other thing that is a challenge for many people is to know what kind of indicators they are going to use. Because if you enter into any computer, any Google Scholar to look for the indicators, you can find 2,000 different indicators and you don't know how to start. For that reason, we think that we need to select indicators that are very simple, especially for farmers, and they are very easy to interpret, and they need to be very sensitive, that one practice reflects the process that we need to evaluate. And the other thing in terms of the two pillars that we work in agroecology is soil quality and plant health. So for that reason, we need to use indicators that combine not only physical and chemical indicators as any sample, soil sample that you send to any laboratory, but also the biological indicators that are very important in the process, ecological processes. And in terms of the plant health, I think it's very important. One of the elements that we talk always in agroecology is biodiversity. But what kind of biodiversity do we need to measure? How we are going to see the relationship between vegetational diversity, the right vegetational diversity that the farmers need, and related to the plant health, instead of pest disease incidents. So I'm going to share these two methodologies. And so in terms to assess soil quality and plant health, we developed a very simple methodology in Costa Rica when we spent some time there in Turrialba. And the idea was to work in these two pillars, as I mentioned, below and above ground biodiversity. And for that, we try to assess what kind of indicators are very important for farmers. So this was a participatory methodology that we developed with peasants in Costa Rica. And yes. So here you can see the first thing is through participatory approach, ask the farmers what is a good soil for you. So there are so many indicators that are important for them, and the idea was to give values 1 to 10. Given 1, the value 1 is the less desirable value, 5 is moderate, and 10 is the good value. So after this kind of work that we did with farmers, then we take the mean of crop health and soil quality, and then we represent this in amoeba. And the amoeba is like a photo that farmers can see where they need to intervene because certain indicators are so weak. And here you can see the list of different indicators. So we give the characteristics to guide farmers to see what value do they need to give. They can give value 1 to 10, they can give 6, 7, or 2 or 3, but we explain what is 1, for example, in the case of a structure, what is 1, what is 5, and what is 10. Same with microbial activity or soil cover, different kind of indicators, very easy and very simple. In 2 hours, that farmers are taking the time to evaluate their farm, they can be able to see how is the soil quality that they have. And the same with indicators of plant health, in terms of appearance, crop growth, disease incidence, and landscape diversity or vegetational diversity. As Miguel was mentioning, we try to establish certain kind of range that farmers can look how is the situation of functional biodiversity or pest incidents. And then we as extensionists or scientists, what we are doing is facilitate the process of interpretation of data rather than evaluate for them. Farmers are the ones who are going to evaluate their own farm. And the same with genetic diversity. If they are using more than 2 or 3 genetic diversity in terms of different crops that they have, different varieties. And the principle of biological active soil, if they have good macrofauna, mesofauna, or microfauna. And also the accumulation of organic matter, so it's easy to evaluate and farmers can have a value of that. And functional biodiversity, how many predators or parasitoid or decomposer do they have in certain area of their farm, and that you can do the analysis with the amount of pests that they can find. And also if they have animal integration, small or or big animal like in the silvopastoral system, and what is the level of integration that they have, and if they close the cycles. And this is just an example of indicators that we use in one of the exercises with them, visiting 2 different farms. So you can see the landscape diversity, the amount and type of vegetation that is surrounding the farm, the on-farm crop and animal diversity, the number of species, genetic diversity, the number of crop variety that they have, the soil quality. You can have just another amoeba of soil quality, another amoeba of plant health, signs of degradation, plant health, dependence on external inputs, levels of food self-sufficiency, interactions, and also resilience that we have explained later. But you can see here we have 2 different agroecosystems, and you can see that these are the different indicators, and with this amoeba shows the farmers where they are and how they can improve different indicators. Yes? And now I'm going to move to the resiliency, because I think we use some of the previous methodology, but we differentiate just on climate change. So the first thing that we need to do, or the first thing that we tried to analyze in our group was what do they adapt and why? Because we know that in certain regions in Latin America we have droughts, in others we have a lot of precipitation, in others, like in the Caribbean, we have a lot of hurricanes, so the group were very diverse. So it was very important for us to start with this question. Then, who did they adapt? What are the processes that they are using? And then, what are the impacts in the ecosystem, in the socioeconomics, and also the integrated system? What are the cost benefits in this relationship? How well do they adapt? What is the evolution that they have? So this was the first 2 years that we did the evaluation in 8 countries in Latin America. And then what are the characteristics and goals and values of these communities that are most of the examples that Miguel presented. So Miguel already talked about this definition of resiliency, but it's not just an ecological resiliency, it's also a social resiliency. So for that reason, we have even a book in Spanish in our website. It's called The Socio-Ecological Resilience Using Agroecology as a Main Base of our research. And as Miguel showed this morning, we started with, after this happened a specific event in different countries, we move and evaluate different main aspects that we observed that were very important in the resiliency. The landscape, at the landscape level, the matrix, the ecological matrix, the landscape matrix. And then how the farmers are using the diversity to protect their farm. And also everything that has to be with soil and water management, depending if they are in drought or with a lot of rain. And this process is also a participatory method, simple methodologies that farmers can evaluate how the farms are performing. And we started this project in Oaxaca, in the same region that Miguel presented on Maíz de Cajete. And because the people that work in this particular community were indigenous people that didn't speak well Spanish, so we tried to use this facial iconography that with a happy face. So we have these 3, it's like a stop light methodology with colors. But here we have the sad for marginal condition that can evaluate their own farm, normal or acceptable, and happy face if they are very resilient. So here you can see the different kind of indicators that we evaluate at the landscape, at the farm level, and the soil quality. Why? Because they are mainly in a slope region, and the indicators can change according to the context of different group of farmers. And you can see here just a comparison between different kind of farms, and you can see that the colors change, and here are the farmers' indicators, and this gives them an idea if they are in condition to move into the more resilient farm, or they can have a happy face because they are in good condition. So you can see that this methodology became very ludic methodology because the kids were the ones who participate with the model. Mainly women were the ones who participate in this research. And you can see here that when they have yellow or red face means that they have to do something, especially at the landscape level. You can see that at the crop management they are very good, and same with soil quality. And the idea was to see how the farmers need to get organized, and we as a facilitators help them to see how they can move from sad phase into more happy phase. Okay? And through Campesino Campesino, they share the information and they explain other farmers what is the best practice that they can improve their systems. And the same with this project in Talamanca, Costa Rica, and also Nicaragua. We did this project, but just with the traffic light. And you can see here that we evaluate just the vulnerability, and green, yellow, and red. And the idea was how we can move from red to yellow and red. And here we have different kind of indicators, and the evaluation was just 1 to 5. So giving values 1 to 2 if they are red, high vulnerability, 3 to 4 if they are medium vulnerability, and green if they have a high resiliency or low vulnerability. And here what farmers are doing is just checking how they are having different indicators. And here it's very important to understand that the most important event that they have here are hurricanes. So in this particular list of indicators reflect the important climatic event that they have. And also because they are in the slopes, they need to measure the slope and the exposure that they have or the wind.
And they're comparing two systems, one diversified and the other one simplified, agroforestry.
The agroforestry system. But the idea was to show farmers what is green, yellow, red, to give like a characteristic for them to easily understand what do they need to evaluate. And here are what Miguel was saying. We were comparing agroforestry systems that are very diversified, that is the green one, compared with the cacao plus banana, that is very simple agroforestry system. I want to finish with this slide because summarize more or less our position and how agroecology works. And here, for example, this is like the status quo, how they confront climate change, and probably the technologies and the input that they maintain, and using climate smart, and the adaptation, new varieties. Probably it's in these two slopes that we are right now, with, for example, many organic stay there. But what we want from agroecology is more like radical and systemic approach, where we work on the socio-ecological systems and also to understand what are the root causes of the problem. And if conventional agriculture realize that it's the system that they have that are causing the problem, that they need to move and to transform their system and to move to more agroecological approach, I think will be great. And also, there are the different scales. It could be at the national that you have this insurance of credit to help farmers. At the regional, at the territorial level that Miguel was explaining the importance to transform the territorial system and to not only to work at the farm but at the territorial. But for that we need empowerment of knowledge of farmers, the networks of farmers, in order to have response capacity, and the territorial innovation, like for example the case of the last example that I showed, and also the territorial articulation between organizations. I think it's very...
So, thank you. So, yeah, we have actually, this is in the internet, we're going to circulate. If anybody we only have 3 copies, so I don't know. But you can download this methodology from the internet in English. And there's also this magazine called Farming Matters, where we have a whole issue on climate change and agroecology and climate change, so if you want to circulate. And then this little booklet, you can also find it in the internet for free, called Agroecology Key Concepts and Principles and Practices. And also you can download it. But whoever wants to stay with them, be democratic or whatever. Okay, so, and then in those of you that speak Spanish, we have a socla.co. We have a huge amount of information there from the society, the Latin American Scientific Society of Agroecology. And you can also visit our website called agroecology.org, agroeco.org, I'm sorry. So, I forgot your question, Kim. But basically in Cuba, for example, they didn't have the corporate agriculture that we have here. They had very large state farms. Those ones are collapsed, and they're doing a lot of redistribution of land. They're breaking down the land to small sizes.
I think the biggest question I have worldwide is that all those areas that have gone to desertification, and that you have an advantage, obviously, with more moisture and more moisture regimes, must be that much progressively more difficult.
Yeah.
And when you get into arid circumstances.
Definitely it's much more challenging, the areas that are semi-arid, but there's a lot of strategies that farmers have developed, and I show some examples. So I think that's I think for droughts, definitely the main approaches is varieties, local varieties that are adapted. There are many varieties of corn and beans and cassava and you name it that are actually drought resistant, drought tolerant. Organic matter content, increased organic matter content. Biological activity, especially mycorrhizal. That's very fundamental. And then any other practices that are going to reduce your evaporation, because transpiration is productive loss of water, but evaporation is non-productive loss of water. So you want to keep evaporation down as much as possible.
And the other thing is water harvesting, because in semi-arid regions it rains like 300 millimeters a year, but it rains in 2 months. So you need to harvest that water, compared with a lot of water that we have in Colombia, for example, 8,000 millimeters. So you need to deal with this kind of issue.
So in one of the slides, it looked like you were saying that the Chinampa systems were shrinking over time, and you were also mentioning how it was a flood area. I wonder, I'm curious if in those systems, if it might be tied in some way to perhaps upstream systems having the use of persistent herbicides of some type or some other toxin?
Well, what happened is that where Mexico City used to be a lagoon, a lake. It was called the Lake of the Moon. That's where the Aztec lived. And they developed this agriculture. They started the Chinampas were islands. They're floating islands. They basically did a lot of tree trunks and so on, and they put compost on top of it. And then these gardens were floating. And then they actually, because of their weight, they sunk and they created this Chinampa rice fields. And the reason why it's shrinking is because Mexico City started extracting the water dramatically. And the Spanish, what they did is they drained the lake. That's what the Spanish did. They drained the lake. So the systems were very well adapted to those conditions. And the population of the Aztecs in the Valley of the Moon was calculated to be 2 million people that were fed with this system. So now there's only about 40 hectares left. But they're still there. The problem is the quality of the water that comes from the Mexico City comes back, black waters and so on, and it's creating all kinds of problems. Probably herbicides come in there too.
On a scale of 0 to 100, how would you describe our current understanding of soil as a system?
Depends. I mean, if you ask, it depends on how you understand soil. Because for indigenous people, soil is Pachamama, is the Mother Earth. So they understand it with cosmovision in addition. So it's not just a scientific understanding of soil and ecology and that is a life system with all kinds of interactions, blah, blah, blah. They understand it spiritually and they treat it that way. So those people, in my opinion, are 100%. They understand 100% because they bring this dimension that is much more spiritual in nature. And they have also other indicators that we don't use. I was talking about the soil, the sound of the soil, or the taste of the soil, the smell of the soil, and the color of the soil. There are all kinds of indicators that they use that we don't use. It's a different taxonomy. It's not that they're right or wrong. It's just a different way of understanding nature. Very different from the way we understand nature. And those people have been there for thousands of years, so they have to have something right. You know, our agriculture with our university knowledge has been around, 60 years, 70 years, we're already in trouble. So we might be doing something wrong. Maybe we are classifying nature not in the way we should. We are not understanding nature the way we should. So it's difficult to understand, to answer that question, but I would say that people, indigenous people, farmers, small farmers, and not only in the developing countries here in the US, I know many farmers that have a very deep knowledge of their soil, but they don't speak the same language that we do in academia, you know.
As an entomologist, is there anything to climate change and getting unusual bugs or things that we're not going to be able to make life difficult?
Yeah, well,
New pests.
huh?
New pests.
On the one side, we get a lot of pests because of they're exotic. They're coming with the shipments. You know, every ship that comes with these diseases and pests. In California, constantly we have exotic pests and so on. So that's something. But then what happens is that climate change is changing the range of distribution, and then the management of the crops also affects. I mean, the data that the doctor just showed this morning, this afternoon, was very interesting. How certain aphids and certain beetles seem to be proliferating in crops that are growing in high CO2 environment. What kind of interactions are going on? There was a very misunderstood scientist, a French scientist called Francis Chausseau, who wrote a book called Trophobiosis. And he said that chemical fertilizers were responsible for pest problems and disease problems because basically what happens, if you apply synthetic nitrogen in the form of ammonia or whatever, urea, the plant is not able to metabolize all that nitrogen into protein and amino acids, and there's a lot of free nitrogen in the foliage, and that explains why homopteran insects, aphids, whiteflies, and so on take off, because they use that nitrogen for their reproduction. And so it could be that in soils that are becoming more and more degraded because of climate change or management that we do, then that those soils actually require more nitrogen, and at the same time the interaction of the Chausseau theory plus climate change might enhance pest problems. I'm not an entomologist anymore, working too much with bugs. I use them more as indicators that the system is in trouble.
I just wanted to say one thing about the first question and second question. Probably many people know or are very concerned about the EPCC report that just came out. And I think those reports are very important because take the attention of people, but the problem of these reports is that they are considering agriculture as just one kind of agriculture. And they say that the agriculture is causing most of the emission, as Miguel was showing, but it's industrial agriculture. Because this is a kind of agriculture that are causing the problem. But the example that we show from small farmers are the agriculture that are cooling the planet. And most of the solutions that we are looking for are done there. And I think it's a change of how we perceive science, what kind of science are we doing in terms of the university and our students, and also what kind of research is necessary to scaling up all these examples, and what kind of methodologies we provide to farmers in order to improve their systems or share the knowledge to demonstrate that those systems are very resilient. So I think this is two ways how we interpret these reports that are very important. I don't think that is important, but we need to show to the society that also small farmers have many solutions And the scientists have been very arrogant. We as a scientists have been very arrogant, thinking that we have the solution. And most of the solutions are done there. Because this is what we did the first 2 years, we just went down there in Latin America, seeing what they are doing after this climatic event. And then we come out with the idea to evaluate and to come out with this methodology that I mentioned. And in terms of your question about insects, I'm an entomologist too. And not anymore, but it's very interesting because there are so many new pests that because many crops have moving in altitude, farmers are not used to manage those pests. So for them it's a challenge. And again, it's not the pest, it's how we are going to design the farm, because it could be any pest. It's how we are going to design the farm to be more resilient, because more events are going to come anyway. Even if they don't have to do anything with climate change, they're the recipients of climate change, the small farmers.
When I did my thesis of master's back in 1974, I studied intercropping of corn and beans as opposed to corn monoculture, and fall armyworm fell 70% in the polyculture system because of natural enemy activity in the polyculture. So it's a matter of diversity, basically, as Clara said. Now, the principles of agriculture are universal, so you can apply them in Montana, you can apply them in Alaska, you can apply them in the tropics, anywhere. It's just going to take different forms, different technological forms. So here, for example, you can create polycultures that are genetic polycultures, mixtures of varieties, grains. This is something that farmers have used in the Mediterranean region, for example. Land raising, mixing varieties of wheat or barley, or even mixes of different grains together. That's a very important strategy. It's a diversification strategy. It's a principle of agriculture, genetic diversity, that takes the form of multi-lines or mixing varieties that have tremendous impacts in terms of disease incidence reduction, or if we have a drought, some varieties will thrive, others will dry, and so on and so on. So genetic diversity can be one approach. The other approach is obviously strict intercropping that can be done mechanized. And the other approach is to have these complex rotations where you introduce the legumes into your rotation system and break the life cycles of pests and diseases and weeds and so on and so on. So to me, when people ask me for recommendations, I just say, look, these are the principles. Look out for the practices that are going to translate those principles into action. It's as simple as that. These are principles, it's not recommendations. And in agroecology, we don't work with recommendations, and it's so dangerous to come up with recommendations. You know, because I could tell you, for example, bring these flowers, you know, that we grow in California, and for example, we use buckwheat as a source of beneficial insects. You can grow it. You can grow it here. I understand in the rotation buckwheat. It's a fantastic plant. It has multiple functions. So in that sense, basically the answer is, how do you translate into strategies ecological principles for what? To foment the processes that are necessary for the system to work.
If the system is skewed by almost fascist kinds of controls in the social-economic basis of that system.
But then you can get away from that by applying agroecology, because you become more autonomous. So one of the things that we're finding in Latin America is that farmers become autonomous. So one of the things that farmers are is with debt. And one way to break the debt is to become food sovereign, technologically sovereign, and energetically sovereign. Okay? Bruce, and then you there.
I'm going to interpret Joseph's question just a little differently.
Okay.
To ask him. I think the question he was getting at, and because I think it's important too, and I think that the question is, as you move to a resilience based on a chronic effect, like drought, it's kind of fundamentally different from an event, a hurricane, or a flood, or a major rain event of some sort, which we have a little bit, but the drought is really probably the one that we're most after. So when you try to come up with some of the metrics for a chronic effect, it's a little bit different. So just to give an example, you use land equivalent ratio, which I find is interesting, but when you're in a system that's on an edge already, that you have some major limitations, let's just say moisture, it seems like that's a moving scale based on how close you are to that. There's kind of a threshold effect in that,
Right.
in the use of that. So how do you see manipulating some of those things to the chronic, some of the indicators of resilience for a chronic effect versus these more acute kinds of
Yeah. Your question is too academic for me.
Sorry.
I'm an emeritus professor. You guys figure that out. I see that the conversion process has to take into that into consideration. But again, there are limits. There are limits to resiliency. I mean, how much more drought can farmers tolerate here in this area? I mean, there's going to be a point where you can't. So, I went to a conference I'm sorry I don't answer your question because I don't know the answer. But we went to a conference with Clara, well, not a conference. I was given in Japan a prize called the Earth Hall of Fame. And the other person that received it is a man called Dennis Meadows, who wrote a book called The Limits to Growth in 1972. And Dennis Meadows wrote a book saying that if economic growth continues, this is in 1972, this is what's going to happen. And he predicted exactly what's going on today. He published that book with a bunch of other authors, sponsored by the Club of Rome. And when he gave his talk, everybody was expecting to have this fantastic academic talk with models and so on. He got up there, his talk was very brief. He said, forget about sustainability, forget about the UN goals of sustainability. Resiliency, what's going to support what's coming? What's going to withstand what's coming? That's basically his message. Like I said, I published that book. Nobody paid attention. Well, it was in the news. It was discussed in academia. Nothing changed. Things continue. Here we are. And what he did is he retired 20 years ago. He moved to New Jersey, and he's teaching children how to garden. He said, that's the most important thing that I can do. Forget about more reports, more papers, more stuff like that. I think we have enough science on climate change, I was in Iowa a month ago, and I said, how much more research do you need to do on corn? All the land-grant universities have been doing research on this. How much research do we need to do on climate change? I mean, we have 12 years left, according to IPCC, to change the course. And even, as the doctor said, even if we stop today emitting, we're going to have the effects of climate change that we have right now for 50 years or more, because there's so much heat in the ocean that the climate is already altered for the next 5 decades. So resilience is the question. How are we going to figure it out? We can do a lot of this research, but I think we already have some rules of thumb. And those rules of thumb come from these people that have been farming for centuries, that withstood the test of time. They withstood the test of time. Those systems, to me, are the inspiration. And we need to derive the principles of resiliency. We don't have to copy the chinampas or the waruwaris, no. The principles, and apply them. And that's going to take a different form in Montana. That's going to take a different form in California, in Colombia, different forms. But in order to scale that up, we need to get socially organized. And obviously, the political economy is not conducive with the leaders that we have worldwide. And what we need to do is at the grassroots level. Social organization, political organization, local activities. I have maybe, 10 years left, I have no idea. And what we're doing now with Clara, although she has much more than I, is we're doing concrete work. For example, this summer we spent in Colombia building lighthouses in rural schools, model farms in rural schools. That's what needs to be done, just like concrete things. Gardens in Oakland, in the neighborhoods of Afro-American people that don't have access to food. One garden at a time, one farm at a time. That's not the way we're going to change the world. We cannot change the system. We need to create a bypass. That's what we need to do, the bypass. Because this dominant system is going to collapse, and the bypass is the one that's going to save humanity. It's not the dominant system. But the bypass cannot have the same logic. It cannot be working within the main structure, because that's a reformist approach. you're gonna use the cracks and paint the system a little. No, we need a totally radically new system. The bypass is something that economic transactions are important, but there have to be many other considerations, solidarity, and so on and so on. And here, maybe we become a little bit more religious in the sense that a lot of masters have talked about the jump of consciousness. In order for us to implement change at the societal level, we need to change inside. You know, I'm not talking about becoming Catholic or evangelical. I'm talking about a jump of consciousness. Change our consciousness and evolve as human beings.
You know, I think in the U.S. that I grew up in just 60 years, that consciousness existed on small farms in the East and Midwest where I grew up.
Sure.
And the autonomy of those farmers is still there in isolated locations.
Yeah.
But the whole country, with this raise of advertising, TV, and the rest, accepted the big ag. Therefore, that opened up all kinds of possibilities. Now we don't need the land anymore, and we don't need you on the land anymore. Now we can build suburbs out to infinity, you know, before they wouldn't get in. So
You had the last question there.
But I was curious how you would effectively jumpstart a social movement and sustain that energy, especially inside of an indigenous community here in North America where there's been oppression. How would you get a movement?
I think I don't want to romanticize either traditional knowledge and social movements because I think they have very good things, but also they need to improve their systems. And even in the social movements, the discourse is amazing. You know, when you go to the Via Campesina meetings or the MST, you energize yourself. You say, okay, we are in a good track. But when you go and visit the farms, there's something that is not doing well. So we cannot just romanticize and think that they are doing amazing. We need each other. This is, I think, my personal opinion. And I was president of SOCLA for 5 years. I just stepped down 2 weeks ago. But since 2007 that we create SOCLA, our main goal was to work with farmers. And even that it's a scientific society, is always our, foot down are farmers. So they are part of our society. And they, not only to do research for them, it's all, because I always say that we as an agroecologist, we are behind them trying to understand why the system works. Because as an entomologist, I did my PhD in entomology. I was very interested just on pests. And I went to visit farmers, and if he didn't have pests, I was not interested in that farmer. As an entomologist, we were trained like that. Because we wanted to solve the problem of pests, or armyworms, or whatever pest we have. As an agroecologist, I need to stay there where farmers don't have pests, because I need to understand why these farmers don't have pests. The perception is totally different. So I think for that reason, working with farmers, for me, has been my university, because I have learned a lot from them. And I can say that also we help them. To try to facilitate in those process of learning are very important. But I think they feel confident when you work at the same level, because agroecology is a marriage of wisdom. They know better, but we also know. I don't want to say that agronomy is not important. I think it's very important that we know about soil, insect, diseases, that probably farmers don't have the knowledge about cycles. And we know how we can work together. And I think it has been very important for us. I don't know if I answered the question, but...
Now, one of the things that we have found is that poverty is not only a physical condition, but a psychological condition. So oppressed people also have this low esteem, very low esteem, and they don't see kind of the light at the end of the tunnel. So when we build the lighthouses, people come to visit those farms that are in the same region that they live and with the same resources, and that provokes a psychological unblocking. It's like the bulb comes on, like, oh, why didn't I think of this before? So there's a psychological unblocking that happens when you have the demonstration farms that are working. So it is very important to see that, especially indigenous people that have been oppressed, or poor people, you have to promote that unblocking. And agroecology is a tool. I mean, there are ways in which you can unblock by political conscientization and other mechanisms. But by having examples, that's another way of unblocking psychologically poor people, and then they take action. But then they have to get organized politically. It cannot be done alone. It has to be collective.
Thank you. Those are some amazing messages, at least for me, right there in those last 10, 15 minutes. So thank you for thinking through those questions, and you answered them. I feel like you answered Bruce's question very, very well.